basted around the entire bottom of my sports bra just to keep all my layers together. I'm just going off and trimming some of these little serger tails. I'm going to leave my center notch right now. Make sure when you are basting you allow that main fabric to wrap around to the back on these two back edges. Now I'm going to take my band, which I also cut a center notch at, and I'm just going to align it to the inside, the right side of my band, to the inside of my sports bra. You do not need to stretch the band, so I'm just going to add a few more pins in. All along. Again, not stretching, not easing in, just nice, easy 1-to-1 ratio here. Your band will come out further than your sports bra. And at this point, what I like to do is make sure that I'm going to get these exactly the same. So I like to mark exactly where my edge is right here and make that exactly the same on the other side. Even though you think, well, I'm not going to stretch this side either, you know what, just in case you eased it in a tiny bit or you stretched it a tiny bit, this makes sure they're at least perfectly even on both sides, which is important because you're going to want your hook, your bra clasp, to be right in the center of your back. You don't want it off to one side. Okay, so I have my band pinned on. I double checked that and you know what, it's still a little uneven. So I'm going to take this side, make it perfectly even because that's important to me, that my clasp is perfectly centered in the back. So even though I marked it, I must have eased this one in a tiny bit. It's very easy to do with knit fabrics. So repin that and mark again. It also can just be maybe I took a very slightly wrong seam allowance on one side versus the other. Okay, I think we are perfectly even now. What I'm going to do is zip around this whole bottom with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to use my serger because it does give a good 1/4 inch seam allowance. I also love to have the serged edge right here because with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, it gives me that perfect visual of how much I need to fold that under on the end. And I'll show you that here in a minute. Now, I could tell it was pulling my fabric a little bit. I'm trying again. Say, don't do that. Okay. I always think my serger starts out a little not precisely. Try to combat that a little bit. I'm going pretty quickly because I basted everything together and I know I'm getting all those layers. Trim off that little center notch I have. You can turn off the knife if that makes you nervous. You can leave it on here. It doesn't really matter here. You're not... Anything that you accidentally nick here will be perfectly fine. Unlike when you're attaching the elastic and you have to be super careful to not nick it. just double checking, even though I basted it, that I got it all on there, that my stitches are okay around these thicker parts. Sometimes I like to go over these thicker parts if I didn't think, if maybe it skipped a stitch or anything. I have a pretty basic, cheaper model serger, so sometimes going over those elastics is hard for it. I just like to make sure it's a nice strong stitch right over those thick parts. It looks like it did okay this time, so no need to go over anywhere. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to serge along this bottom. If you don't have a serger, that's okay. I would recommend finding a zigzag stitch that is 1/4 inch and going along the edge, or an overcast stitch. Not because it's going to fray, but just because it's really nice to have the stability on the next step. Cutting off my center notch. As you can see, I went ahead and marked it. And you know what, I really didn't need to. I don't need to find the center anymore, so I'm just going to move that up. It was just a habit. So now I have my 2 edges serged. If your fabric will take a press, this is a really good time to press both seams towards each other. So this seam down, and you're going to press this edge up so that they are towards each other. Basically what we're going to do is create a huge binding casing for our elastic. And this will finish these edges that stick out very nicely. So this is why I like to have the serged edge, because it folds very easily right there and right here, and I can tell it's a nice good 1/4 inch seam very easily. Another thing that you could do is press it if your fabric will hold a press. The only problem is a lot of nylon, I really prefer a nylon athletic knit, and a lot of those you can't press on a high heat, and they won't really hold a press, because you can't press with a high heat. Nylon will melt if you press with a high heat. So that's why I really like the serged edge or a small zigzag or overcast stitch, because it basically helps you fold that under at a perfect 1/4 inch. Another thing you can do is use 1/4 inch wash away tape. This works fabulous as well. You can put it on this outside, fold it down perfectly with your tape still on, and then once you take the other side off, and you can iron it on a light setting with a pressing cloth if it's nylon, and it will stick to it and it will hold it in place for you, which is also very nice. So I'm going to go along a little bit of this so you can see me doing it. This is probably the trickiest step in the sports bra, because so far we haven't had really any tricky steps, especially if you're comfortable working with these fabrics and you're comfortable with putting in elastic. So I'm going to fold these towards each other, and now I'm just going to meet the folds at the top, and I'm going to put in a lot of pins. I like to use a lot of pins, you'll see. I always put one right here at the elastic because it's thicker, and usually whatever machine you're using is going to have a hard time getting up and over there. I do one at the edge, and then I immediately go to the center. I do not like to pin from one side to the other, because even though you think you might be doing it perfectly straight, you're probably not. You're probably either easing or stretching it, and your binding is going to show that. It's not going to have a perfect fold on the bottom. So I like to go to the middle, make sure I'm folding it perfectly straight up, fold that seam allowance down, cover my seam allowance at the top. Now this step is going to take some time. You want You want to make sure this is pulled tight down, this is pressed down, this is pressed down, and everything is right in the correct spot before pinning. So you really want to take your time with this step. If you don't take your time with this step, one, sewing it down is going to be very frustrating. And two, you're probably not going to be happy with the way it looks in the end. So I did the first side, I did the center, now I'm coming to do the other side. I find it super important not to start at one side and go all the way to the other, because even though you might not mean to ease or stretch it in, I usually find you do just a tiny bit one way or the other. You might ease in part of it and then stretch part of it, and your band will want to, will just look a little wonky, for lack of a better word. But I just like to start at both ends and then do the center. And then again, I don't like to work my way from center all the way over. I just like to kind of do it in the middle and make sure my fold is nice and even. I'm not stretching the top one way or the other. We really advise to take your time on this step as much as you can. The more you prep this step nice and carefully, the easier it is to stitch it, the happier you're going to be with the final look. I put in a lot of pins. If your fabric can take a press and you can use a 1/4 inch wash away stay tape, you can do that. You have to make sure it's a wash away because you don't want to lose your stretch there. Being a sports bra, it's got a lot of negative ease, so it definitely needs to be able to stretch to your body. Again, here's my here's my center. Here's the edge. I've already done one here. I'm going to throw one in right here first. Just going to continue pinning until I'm happy with the way my band looks, and I think that I can sew between each pin easily. That's why I do so many pins, because once I take one out, I want to be able to make it to the next pin without being frustrated in any way, about keeping everything nice and neat and perfect. You can sew this next step with your favorite stretch stitch. You can do it on your cover stitch if you have a cover stitch. I'm going to do a triple step zigzag, since that's what I did on these seams. Okay, here we are at the sewing machine. Gonna click on my triple step zigzag. I am going to try to keep my stitch almost hitting that fold, very, very close. As you can see, once I remove that pin, it came out from covering that little seam allowance right there. So that is why I like to have my pins super close. Go nice and slow over this elastic edge right here. If If you rush over that seam and elastic, it might skip some stitches on you. Never want that. Again, I'm going to go over a seam right here, so I'm going to go nice and slow. Pick up the speed a little bit on the smooth part. And I'm going to go nice and slow over this elastic. There we go. Nice and slow on this end where there's not as much stabilizing it. And there's the front. So you can see I like to get my stitch really close to the edge. And then here it is along the back.